This episode is dedicated to the memory of Queen Elizabeth II of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, a sovereign lady of the United Kingdom and the British Commonwealth, a worthy successor to her royal forefathers, and a great servant of her country, her free people, and their laws.
Choice of our nation, our chieftain so brave and so true. We'll go for the great Reformation, for Lincoln and liberty too. We'll go for the son of Kentucky, the hero of Hoosierdom through. The pride of the suckers so lucky, for Lincoln and liberty too.
Hi, this is Joseph.
Hi, this is Isaac.
Hi, Isaac. We're starting Season 2, Episode 2 of the Einrod podcast. We're going to be talking about Cicero.
And, of course, about one of his great rivals, Catiline.
I will start with Cicero, and Isaac will cover Catiline and the Catiline conspiracy. In 63 BC, the Catiline conspiracy took place. But that was perhaps the second most important event that took place in that year. The first important event was the birth of Octavius, later Augustus, first emperor of Rome. Perhaps, arguably, his birth was of such severe importance. Let me say something about Cicero, uttered by Augustus, an epithet. He said to his grandson once, when the grandchild, had been reading a book by Cicero and he was caught by his grandpa, the emperor of the Romans, the most powerful man in the world. He was kind of embarrassed and he put the book away because he was caught reading the book by Augustus's erstwhile opponent. And Augustus said, "No, don't do that." He said something to that effect, probably in Latin. And then he read a large section of the book, and then he said, "My child, this was a learned man and a lover of his country." And in those two aspects of Cicero's life, allow me to speak of. I think the life, the death, and the times of Cicero really introduces us to the period, to the great events, to many of the elements of the Roman world that are fascinating and important. So let me see if I could speak a little bit about each one. We said about him that he's a learned man. He himself said about himself, when he was asked if he was a rhetorician, and he was arguably the greatest master of rhetoric in the world, he said about himself that he was a philosopher and a lover of his country. His service to the Rome as a republic and then into the birth of the empire was legendary, it was comprehensive, and it was in myriad fashions. Arguably, as Isaac will discuss soon, his greatest service to the empire was that of the Catiline conspiracy and how he opposed that. So that's as far as lover of the country. Let's go back to the learned man, as Augustus calls him. Let's speak a little bit about his eloquence, for which he is famous. As he himself would tell you, he was not shy about speaking of his virtues in his eloquent speech writing. Cicero had traveled to study rhetoric under perhaps one of the great rhetoricians of his time, Polonius, who, ironically enough, was also Julius Caesar, no poor rhetorician himself, his teacher as well. Cicero had learned from him. Cicero was supposed to hold forth, but Apollonius asked him to do it in Greek because he didn't really know the Latin. So Cicero, even though Greek was obviously not his first language, him being a Roman citizen and all, he poured forth in Greek. And all the students around him praised him, and they vied with each other to praise his eloquent speech. But Apollonius, the teacher, the great rhetorician, looking at his student, sat there quietly for a long time, and Cicero, who was a little bit of an impatient person at times, was obviously going nuts. And then eventually, Apollonius said this about Cicero, his students. He says, "You have my praise and admiration, Cicero. and Greece my pity and my commiseration, since those arts and that eloquence, which are the only glories that remain to her, in other words, to Greece, will now be transferred by you to Rome. That was high praise indeed. Cicero, rhetorician. He wasn't strictly just a talker. He was also sometimes involved in war and in battle. He fought in battle. He himself led troops in the east when he was given a position, I believe, in Armenia, though the exact detail escapes me.
Mm-hmm. As well, he was elected as a praetor, and later he became consul. But of course, in Rome, no civil office was just a civil office. Almost every civil office, carried with it military obligations.
Yes. So in that case, he was a general. He also fought perhaps as a foot soldier early in his life as Sulla. We should say early in his life. He was born in 106 BC. He died a fairly old man. We may get to his death in a moment. So he was also a soldier in his youth. He was in his middle life. He was he actually commanded troops, and later, towards the end of his life, he was actually offered under Pompey, but he refused. We may get to that later. Some of his acquaintances were kind of annoyed that he didn't involve himself in the military affairs of the civil war, Pompey against Julius Caesar. Let me speak a moment about his philosophy. I will just say one thing. Cicero, a great philosopher, like we said, he said about himself he's a philosopher. I would argue that his greatest contribution to philosophy is one sentence, when he said, Aristotle's writings are rivers of liquid gold. Now, why is this important? Because we have Aristotle's writings, and they are not liquid gold. So
yeah.
Which is why, for a long time, there has been question as to whether we have any of the original manuscripts of Aristotle. There's kind of two levels to this question. It's kind of assumed that Aristotle did not publish anything in his lifetime. He just kept things in manuscript form, which he kept on updating, which is why you see references from earlier works to later works and vice versa, which would obviously be the case that he was updating it. But the higher level, which is that Aristotle writings were either by himself or by one of his students to be kind of the cliff notes, the class notes for his lectures, because unlike Plato, who Cicero also, of course, compliments, Aristotle's work don't appear. So this is why up until this very day there is a controversy regarding Aristotle's writings. A famous story of St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm not sure if we mentioned this when we talked about him previously, that he was going through the Alps once, and someone said, "Wow, isn't this a beautiful sight?" And St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Aristotelian, maybe one of the greatest, if not the greatest, he said, "Well, I would give up this beautiful sight of the Alps just to have some pages of Aristotle's lost manuscripts." That's so far as Aristotle and Cicero. He was also very great in his influence in Rome. Rome at this point was always being dominated by certain individuals who usually represented factions. A little bit later, the three factions, or the three significant factions, were Pompey, who we mentioned, Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Crassus. They formed the triumvirate. Some people call it the first triumvirate. That is another controversy. If there were two, the second triumvirate should be called that. Now, before this, a little bit younger, because like Julius Caesar was 6-7 years younger than him. Before this, before Julius Caesar had really made it and was perhaps a lawyer, Crassus and Pompey were great, both of them being older than Caesar. And the third person that people would pay court to, in a prestige equal to that of Crassus and Pompey, was Cicero himself. So again, one of the foremost citizens of Rome. What other things can we say about him? His annoying personality. One day, he met, a citizen of Rome, Baconius, who had 3 ugly daughters. And he said about him, I'm not sure how far he was from his face. He said about him, this man, he reared a race without Apollo's leave. My understanding is Apollo is the god of beauty. That's kind of his jest. Is there more to it, or that was my understanding?
It is, but I believe that in one version of the myth of the Gorgons, the temple which is violated by Poseidon, while he lays with Medusa, and is a temple of Apollo, not Athena. So therefore, he reared a race without Apollo's leave. He's comparing the 3 daughters to the 3 Gorgons, which are the 3 monstrous sisters from mythology.
And the Gorgons are not renowned for their beauty. So, all right, let's speak a little bit more. We spoke about his annoying personality. We also said about we mentioned that he showed up in Pompey's camp during the Civil War.
Let's make it clear that we're talking that he showed. Are you talking about Pompey the son or Pompey the father?
Pompey Magnus.
Because you mentioned his military career. His earliest military career, military service was in the camp of Pompey Strabo, or Pompey the Cross-eyed, who was the father of Pompey Magnus during the Civil War, and he served without particular distinction.
Yeah, so when he was in the camp, he showed up there, and Cato was Cato and him were kind of a pair, and though they had a bit of a falling out. We won't go into that much at the very moment. So Cato was kind of annoyed.
Cicero used to say that Cato believes that he lives in Plato's Republic, while as a matter of fact, he lives in Romulus' sewer.
Romulus being the mythical and perhaps legendary founder of the Roman Republic. So when he came, now Cato said, "Well, I'm supporting Pompey because it's in line with my prior political commitment, so to speak. Like, what the heck are you doing here?" To paraphrase the original Latin, and he would have wanted him to stay neutral in Rome. That way, in the event that Julius Caesar wins, he could tie himself to Caesar. So while he was at the camp, he was so annoyed, and he kept on undermining morale by going around looking sullen and telling everyone that Pompey didn't know how to fight, to the point that at one point Cato and his friend had to prevent Pompey's henchmen from rushing at Cicero with drawn swords because they considered him guilty of treason. Soon after this story, Cicero returned. He met Caesar on the way. They embraced because Caesar was famous for his magnanimous nature and so on. Let's skip to his end, although there's much more to speak about him. He died in 43 BC. He outlived Julius Caesar. He conspired against the next triumvirate and against Augustus and Mark Antony. Mark Antony particularly hated him. Apparently there was a 3-day session between the second triumvirate as to whether they should include Cicero on the prescription, and to his credit, Augustus defended Cicero vehemently, or so the story goes, but he couldn't. Mark Antony succeeded. Cicero was forced on the run in a litter, and he was killed in such a pathetic manner, while one of his close household servants, who he had instructed personally and shown tremendous beneficence towards, personally betrayed him. Cicero had his head cut off, and his hands, and those two things are usually fatal, and those were sent to Cicero in Rome. So a tragic end to the man who tried and for a long time succeeded in not just defending his republic, but I would say even defining his republic.
Yes. A few more notes on Cicero. Cicero, we mentioned that he fought along the side of Sulla, and Sulla, of course, was the champion of the Optimates, or the aristocratic faction, that believed in things being that, which, largely speaking, is usually portrayed as the conservative faction, but it's not true, because Cicero's personality conveys to us, and career conveys to us, how much the new factions that emerge after the first civil war between the Populares and the Maius and the Optimatus after Sulla, how much those coalition shifts. Because Cicero, first of all, is a what you call a novus homo, which meaning a new man, and which means nobody in his family before him was in the Senate or had any kind of magistracy in the city of Rome, in the Roman state. As a matter of fact, he's not even properly a Roman from Rome. He is a Roman citizen, of course, but he's coming from the Latin town of Arpinum. So what's the difference between Latin and Roman? So, as you know, the Rome stands in the plain of Latium, today called Lazio, and in ancient times, the Romans were part of the Latin coalition, and as Rome rose to prominence, and of course, becoming, it was agreed that Rome is the head of that coalition that eventually encompassed the entirety of Italy, under the Italian coalition, which was wider, and it was agreed that the people who are not Romans but are Latin have more rights, not as much right as Roman citizens, but more rights than Italian allies. And of course, Italian allies have more rights than, let's say, other people outside of Italy. And of course, the elite of every city that Rome dominated was granted the Roman citizenship, and this is the group of people that Cicero comes out from. So we're talking about an aristocratic family, but this is not the high aristocracy. This is like country aristocracy, not the aristocracy that actually governs the state. And as a matter of fact, Cicero comes from the same town, Arpinum, that Gaius Marius comes from. And of course, this gives him the same trouble as Gaius Marius himself had when he started his political career.
You mentioned that he comes from that place, which reminded me of another short incident about his birth, which he himself credited as a true prophecy. So when he was born, a vision appeared to his nurse and foretold that this child that this nurse was suckling would afterwards become a great benefit to the Roman states. Also, something later, he went to Delphi and he got another great prophecy from them. So something that he was kind of born to greatness despite somewhat meager beginnings, and I would say the meager beginnings of his name. You know, his name is not the most flattering. I think it means chickpea or something.
It
does.
Comes
from the chickpea and from a cleft of somebody's nose back in the day.
It does either that or the family grew chickpeas. But to be fair, it's not the worst name. It was not with the worst cognomen to have. Many Roman families, even noble patrician families, had names which were less than flat, cognomens that were less than flattering. For example, Caepio. There was a noble family whose cognomen was Caepio. Caepio means onion vendor.
I think we may have mentioned this before, but just to tell our audience, what is a cognomen in the Roman
so a Roman
context?
name. A Roman name is made out of three components. At least the old-fashioned classical Republican Roman name. You have the first name. In classical Republican Rome, there are only 15 of them, if I'm not mistaken. That's called the praenomen. Then there was the nomen, which is the family name. And then you had the cognomen, which is either a personal nickname or a nickname that was attached to the family as a whole. So think, for example, our hero, Marcus Tulius Cicero, which means Marcus, that's Marcus, that's his praenomen, his first name, his own name. Tullius, that's the family name. And Cicero, that's the cognomen of that particular branch of the family.
So that was the family nickname as opposed to his personal nickname.
Yes, many people have personal nicknames, but if the personal nickname was was granted by the state, or was particularly good, or was particularly catchy, it tend to stick to the descendants. For example, the the Corneli, there was the family of Scipio, who is known as Scipio Africanus. His actual name was Lucius Cornelius Scipio, and the state granted him an additional nickname Africanus because he defeated the Carthaginians in Africa, and therefore and he was part of the gens Cornelia, which have many branches. Each of them had their own cognomen. For example, we talked about Sulla. Sulla's full name was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, because he belonged to the Cornelii Sullae as opposed to the Cornelii Scipiones.
So you're saying he was not closely but distantly related?
Yes.
To Scipio. Okay, I think that's wraps it up for the first segment of the Iron Rod podcast, season 2, episode 2. We're speaking about the Catiline conspiracy.
Our David's good sling is unerring. The slave Ocrat's giant he slew. So shout for the freedom preferring, for Lincoln and liberty too. We'll go for the son of Kentucky, the hero of Hoosierdom through. The pride of the suckers so lucky, for Lincoln and liberty too.
Welcome, gentlemen. Welcome back to the Iron Rod podcast, season 2, episode 2, in which we will discuss the Catilinarian conspiracy. After my esteemed partner had discussed Cicero, we had a beautiful section for you, but unfortunately the recording was corrupted. So I will commence this section with a short monologue introducing the antagonist of this drama, Catiline, or as his actual name was, Lucius Sergius Catilina. Catiline belonged to a family which was very old and very noble and very patrician. Here we need to explain a slight difference in the Roman Republic between being a nobleman and being a patrician. Almost every patrician was a nobleman, but not all noblemen were patricians. Becoming a nobleman was an easy task. All you need to do is to have either you or one of your ancestors be elected consul. Once you have done that, you and the rest of your families until the ending of the world, presumably, will be considered Roman noblemen. Noble or nobilis means well-known, famous. Now, as you understand, this is a somewhat informal category. It was not a legal category. It was a matter of social standing, and it was based on Rome had this understanding that it's good to keep government a family business. So if someone's grandfather was a consul, they would say, well, his grandfather was a consul, his father was a consul, surely he can be a consul too. Surely he was instructed. And it makes more sense when you understand that the Roman Republic that Roman politics were arranged around families. Families mostly voted as units. Of course, this is also unofficial. It was not part of the law, but families tend to become same as to vote together, and of course, families were subsections of what we called gens. Gens is the singular for what we call a clan, and here we get to, for example, if we think of Scipio Africanus, or the guy who's called Cornelius Scipio Africanus, belonged to the gens Cornelia, and he belongs to the familia of the Cornelii Scipiones. And of course, his descendants were known as the Cornelii Scipiones Africani. So you can see how the same gens, the same clan, or you might say large kinship association, is divided slowly but surely between extended families, and then between households, each with their own legacy and with own dignities and honor and political affiliations. And of course, this changed by individuals. So individuals may steer their families one way or another. And so it's very important that so if you can point out to your family being in position of power, people know that the people you are most likely to counsel with, that they counsel with when you are in position of power, namely your family or your clansmen, are people who held those positions before. So this is the logic behind that. Now, what's a patrician? A patrician in ancient Rome is somebody who belongs to the old aristocracy, to the people who founded Rome. That's as opposing the plebeians. The plebeians are people who, even very old families that have been in Rome for generations, and I'm saying old families that have been in Rome because it was possible, because Rome was one of the few states in the ancient world that was very liberal in its granting of citizenships to people of foreign birth, and they were, and the plebs and the plebeians, who belonged to the social group called the plebs, were descended originally from people who were mostly dependents of the patricians. So, for example, there would be we mentioned the gens Cornelia. Well, the gens Cornelia there are two gens Cornelia, as a matter of fact. There is the patrician gens Cornelia, and of course there are various plebeian families also named Cornelius, but they are not blood related to the patrician Cornelii. Now, once we explained the division within Rome, let us talk about division outside of Rome. So, Rome is the most important city in Italy, and often we equate Rome with Italy. But that's at this point of time in the Roman, that's actually true at this point in time in Rome's history, but it's very recent development, because when Rome started rising to prominence, the first step was, of course, to establish dominance inside its own region in Italy, in the Latin plain, or Lazio, as it's called in modern day Italy. And that was done through the Latin League. So the first thing the Romans do, under the kings and the early republic, is to establish their dominance, and then make alliances with all the city-states of the Latin plain. Once they do that, and since Rome is the most important city in Latium at this point, all the citizens of all the Latins are granted various rights. That's called the Latin right, the Ius Latinum. And then this coalition goes forth to establish its dominance in Italy, and it's finding people like the Samnites, the Etruscans, and various other people. And eventually, the Latin coalition established its dominance over the rest of Italy, and therefore and incorporated into the Italian alliance, or the Società Italica. And therefore, we have a hierarchy. You have Roman citizens, you have Latin, you have holders of the Latin right, and you have Italian allies. And all of those people are very similar to each other, and they all have a higher position in the Roman Republic than anyone from any foreigners from the provinces, and of course beyond the provinces. So, for example, if you are from and Italy in this understanding does not include Gaul, Cisalpine Gaul, which is approximately northern Italy. Mostly what we call now Lombardy. Everything beyond the river Po, which the Romans called the Padus. So for example, but the Gauls over there were considered somewhat like Italians because they adopted a lot of Italian customs and etc., but they were not as Italians as, let's say, someone from Etruria. And so we come to Lucius Sergius Catilina. While Marcus Tulius Cicero was a Latin, he was not an Italian, but he was a Latin, and of course his family were Latin aristocrats, which meant that they have acquired the Roman citizenship very early on. They were still not Romans of Rome. They were from Arpinum, the same place as Gaius Marius now, and none of them ever held high office in Rome. They were new men, novi homoi. Now, Lucius Sergius Catilina, on the other hand, his family was a very old family, a patrician noble family, but nobody in this family really distinguished himself in Roman politics for the last 500 years. And because patrician families often, families decline. It happens. But during the Civil War of Sulla, there was after the civil, Catilina established himself as an ardent supporter of Sulla. He fought under Strabo, just like Cicero did, but he did so in great distinction. As a matter of fact, we found tablets that show that one Lucius Sergius, which we know only of one Lucius Sergius in that period of history, was a member of the military council of Pompey Strabo. So of course he was very, very high up. And after the war, when Sulla's victory was complete, and he started the proscriptions, which means that people that he suspected that were politically suspect were killed, their property was confiscated and then auctioned off for pennies to favored supporters of Sulla, was one of the beneficiaries of these systems was Catilina himself, and he grew exceedingly rich, just like another person who later became a friend and a partner of both Catilina and Caesar, Crassus, who was also gained a lot of wealth this way, but he invested his wealth in various schemes, among which was the original fire brigade, by which I mean that if there is a fire in your house, this brigade will come over, would demand that you fork out some atrocious sum that they evaluate to be close to the value of your house and its content. And if you do so with dispatch, they will take off the fire. If you delay somewhat and the fire already consumed your house and your goods, in such an unfortunate case, Crassus will come over and will say, "I'll buy the lot of your hand where your house used to be, and this way you'll not be completely destitute." And of course, that's an offer you cannot refuse. Crassus, as a matter of fact, was accused of arson by his enemies, and of course Crassus, as a result, was very rich. He loaned money to a number of people, including the Caesar, by the way, Caesar especially, it's significant because Caesar was chronically in debt, financing his political aspirations by bribing voters, or either directly or by throwing lavish games, etc., 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 or just living above his means to maintain his prestige, which was, of course, against the and which needed to be kept under close. This secret was need to be kept under covers because to be in debt was considered to be against senatorial dignitas, and therefore, when we think of Crassus as we should not think him just as a real estate developer or a banker, but we should think of him also as a blackmailer, because if you know that certain senators should be disqualified from the Senate, the political and military career should be cut off, essentially, because they are in debt, and therefore they should be thrown out of the Senate by the censors, and you hold both the debt, which you can forgive at any moment, and the secret, you basically have a very, very firm hold of power, which explains why Crassus was so late to enter the Senate himself. There's not much point. Anyhow, back to Catiline. So Catiline is standing for election to become consul first time 66 BC. And remember, when we talk about the years BC, before the common calendar, before the common Christian calendar, we are going backwards. So first 66, then 65, then 63. So it's 3 times in 3 years. He loses every time. It especially stings when Cicero, whom he knows from the campaigns under Strabo, to be not only not a nobleman or a patrician, but also not to be a particularly brilliant soldier, it's talking about an advocate, for God's sake, wins the consulship in 65. In 66, Catilina loses the elections again. So not only does Catiline rejected in the face of a man that he regards as completely inferior, is even denied the opportunity to serve as a consul after him. So you can imagine his state of mind. So they start conspiring with various other senators whose stars was not shining very bright at that moment. One of which is Cethegus, who collected weapons, and Lentulus, and he is conspiring also with a certain tribe of Cisalpine Gauls called the Allobroges, longtime allies of Rome, even though this alliance is somewhat contentious. It's not a happy relation. It's not a very happy relationship. And they come to an agreement that the Allobroges would stage a revolt, which will force the Senate and the consul to divert the legion station in Italy to the north. While they do that, Catiline and his supporters would stage a coup inside of Rome, and the new regime would be able when once the new regime is well established inside of the city, they would be able to call back the legions, and the Allobroges would step down. The problem is that the Allobroges, when they receive this message, they are extremely confused. It appears to them to be a very weird scheme of things, because of course they know that the Roman Republic have legions outside of Italy, and of course it happened before that when somebody established a regime, tried to seize power in the city of Rome, which was not in a manner which was not to the taste of the magistrate conducting military operation outside of Rome, in Italy or to the north of Italy, or in sufficient proximity to the city, they just turn around on the hills and march on Rome. Sulla did it when Cinna, one of Marius' creatures, tried to establish a new form of democracy in the city. That was the origin of the civil war, as a matter of fact. So they don't, and this does not bode well. So the Alloborges, instead of collaborating with the scheme, they send a deputation to the consul, which Cicero is still the consul, because remember, he was elected at the end of 65, and he is the consul for 66, and this is the end of 66 after an election was already held, which Catilina has lost. So Cicero is still in charge of the. Cicero and his colleague in the consulship are still in charge, and they give him the papers, and Cicero, who suspects for quite a while that something is afoot, goes to the Senate, and in the one of the best speeches ever delivered by any human or being in the past, present, or is likely to be carried in the future, he denounces Catilina, and he shames him in front of the entire Senate. He said, "We caught you. You have nowhere to go. You have no chance but to escape." And of course, the letters named various co-conspirators. We mentioned Cethegus, who collected weapons. We mentioned Lentulus, and of course there were others. But some of the people who are mentioned come forward and they say, "No, we have no hand in it. Nobody discussed it with us. We would never." One of them is Crassus, which and a lot of other people, and many other people are being suspected. But eventually they single out a number of senators and ex-magistrates that should be punished. And first, they are distributed among the living citizens' houses, because Rome does not have a prison, at least not one destined to hold people for a prolonged period of time. And Caesar, as a matter of fact, is also suspected, but but it's decided not to prosecute him because of various reasons. And as a matter of fact, he's put in charge of some prisoners. And so, the Senate debates what to do. We'll discuss again how this debate go. And Catilina left the city. When he left the city, he discovers, we're not sure if he discovered a separate scheme or if it was part of his scheme, that a man by the name of Gaius Manlius was recruiting an army in Etruria made out of former common soldiers of Sulla's army in the Civil War, and rural plebeians and all sorts of other people who had, and even young people from good families who turned into debt and who fell into debt, and this army was supposed to march on Rome. Now, because the linchpin of his operation was already removed, which is an internal coup inside the city of Rome, he has no choice but to annex to himself this ragtag army and try to march on Rome with them. It doesn't end well. He dies, and we will discuss we'll immediately discuss the rest of the details of the plot and its consequences in a moment. So, to conclude, what happens after this failed coup? Well, failed. Well, the first thing that happened, we already mentioned, is a debate in the Senate. The senators, remind you, don't know yet that the army outside, that Manlius' army is about to be defeated. They suspect it will be defeated, but they can't be sure. You can never be sure about these things. They know it's not a very good army, but, strange things happen in war. So they debate about what to do with the prisoners. So, and remember, the prisoners that they are holding are not the leader of the plot. The two leaders of the plot are already outside of Rome, Manlius and Catilina. They are not the problem at hand. But those are important Roman citizens, and they plotted against the Roman Republic. What do you do with that? Well, the usual process would be to bring somebody like that before the courts, and then let the process do its thing, and then officially they will be sentenced to death, but they will be given enough time to get out of Rome and Italy. That was the procedure. They'll go into exile and nothing will happen unless somebody will be too quick, and so but then they are also afraid. Well, first of all, we are not sure who will control the city by tomorrow. We need to act fast, because if, let's say, and besides, we don't know how many people are within the city that sympathize with the plot. We don't know how wide the plot is internally. So we kind of defanged the problem, this particular danger, when we caused Catilina to run out of the city, because he cannot foment the mob to capture important places and to threaten us. But there is still a chance that there is a mob inside the city waiting to march on the Senate and march on the assemblies. So it's possible that if we wait until the morning and bring them before the special courts, there will be we will have a situation on our hands. So we need to do everything tonight, very fast. So, and besides, they say if we just exile them, well, they can, that doesn't really solve the problem, because they can go either to Italy or to the wider empire of our republic and recruit an army and come back to bite us. After all, one of them, Catilina, is already doing effectively that with Manlius' army. So, what to do? So the argument is given to us by a guy named Sallustius, which in English is often just called Sallust. Sallust was a Caesarian in his political inclinations, so he often portrayed Caesar in the best light possible, and he also have the way he describes the argument may not be the most accurate. So he says basically there were three opinions. First, there was Caesar's opinion. Caesar said, no, we cannot just kill them. I'll tell you what, it's not that what they did was not wrong and terrible and horrific in every way, shape or form, but you can't just kill people. First of all, it's against the law. It's illegal. But let's say you don't care about the law. Let's say, you know what, it's there's a senatus consultus ultimum, which means last decree of the Senate, ultimate decree of the Senate, which means in this case that the consul, in this case Cicero, is empowered to act as a dictator to make sure that the republic survives, and all regular laws are suspended. Okay, let's say that this is okay. It says okay. That's not accurate. The dictator is not an absolutist monarch. You cannot just decide that he can do whatever he wants. But let's say that you don't care about what the regular laws say. Now, I know Cicero. I know he's a very decent human being. I like him, to be, as a matter of fact, but he will not be consul forever. As a matter of fact, he won't be consul in a month, and one day we'll elect somebody else, and somebody that might not be that decent, and there will be an emergency, and he'll be declared dictator, or he'll get the senatus consultum in his hand. And if you give a consul with the ultimate decree the power to just kill people willy-nilly, well, that's back to the dictatorship of Sulla, when people would just prescribe left and right and left. So do you really want this? And at this time it would not be just prescription where people will have to would be put in danger or be executed by courts. In this case, or assassinated or whatever this will be, people will be just killed on the spot. Do you really want this? And this is the opinion of that Caesar. So Caesar acts according to the reputation that he really worked the rest of his life to cultivate, which is clemency. We should not forgive them, but we should disperse them throughout Italy. We all have estate houses throughout Italy, and we can hold them throughout Italy so they cannot communicate, and we will have an eye on them. So there's no problem here. We trust each other, no, don't we? Don't we, guys? So Caesar, this is his opinion. Then we have Cicero. Cicero is not that clement. He said, well, I don't like the idea of dispersing them through Italy in the house of various senators, because that's not a solution. I say that we do use the regular process, and that we do use the regular process with those we don't think that dangerous, but some of them should be killed immediately. Cethegus, for example, he cannot live. Cato, on the other hand, Cato is the fiery one. Cato said, no, you guys don't care about the republic, do you? You care only about your estates, your slaves, especially of the female persuasion. The implication is, of course, that the senators rape their slaves on a semi-regular basis. And you like about your pleasures, your wealth. You don't care about the republic at all, do you? Because if you cared an iota about the republic as much as you care about your wealth and your families and your estates, you would not be sitting and deliberating. You would be going out there and you would be driving a good feet of cold, hard Roman steel through their miserable carcasses. And Cato wins the day, and they are killed before the dawn, extrajudicial manner, no trial, no nothing. And Cicero goes at dawn to the forum, because he's the consul. It's his duty to report to the people about the state of the republic, and he declared. Now he cannot say that the conspirators were killed. That will be admitting guilt. He can't say that they died. Well, they were under the supervision of the Senate. How did they die? So they were your responsibility. So what do you do? So he said they had lived, and everybody understood. Okay, the conspirators are dead. Everybody is dead. Everything is gone. The conspiracy is dead, and when the news comes that Manlius' army and Catilina himself is also dead, well, nobody. Well, that's the end of the sad story. Or is it? Because what happens next is, well, Cicero does not retire from politics, or from the law, but he, of course, is a consular. He is, which means he is somebody who used to be a consul. Now he's one of the leading citizens of Rome, and he's a bit bored, so he decides to write the story of his consulship. And it's widely considered to be the worst poem ever written in the Latin language or in any other language. Now, we don't know. I don't know if this judgment is entirely correct, or it's just that Cicero, who was very good at prose, was a fairly mediocre poet. So he was not. I don't think he was that terrible. I think it was just. People expected more. And besides, the subject was. It's never nice to hear someone praising his own actions, especially not when someone describes the national gods, Jupiter, Juno, the rest of that band, talking and telling the story of his success and how he saved the Republic, especially not as there are fairly great amount of people that knew the people were involved in the plot and were still well, not mad, but they were a bit miffed about the manner in which the people were executed, as one may. Family, friends, just people who knew them, people who thought that the plot was exaggerated. And, if you think that citizens of our republic would be glad that the enemies of the republic who tried to overthrow it were dealt with, but that's not always the situation. And not to get political, but we had an opportunity to see something like that. Especially as the letter of the law was not observed here. And so it was not received well. As a matter of fact, in a few years, there was a man named Claudius Pulcher, he belonged to a great old-fashioned patrician family called Claudia, the Gens Claudia, and he decides that he wants to become tribune of the plebs. There's one problem. A patrician naturally cannot be tribune of the plebs. As a matter of fact, he's not even allowed in the assembly of the plebs. But there's a loophole. He allows himself, or he bribes someone, or whatever, to be adopted by someone that he is a plebeian. And by the way, the reason he wants to be tribune of the plebs so much is because he is involved in a very, very terrible religious scandal. We will not we'll leave the details to later, but the outcome of this scandal is first, he cannot have enough political clout anymore to get support to the traditional patrician offices in that good patrician young men compete for. They which are the aedile, the praetor, and of course, and then the quaestor, the aedile, the praetor, the consul, and then the censor, if you are very lucky. But that path is more or less closed to it because of the scandal of the Bonadea festival. Okay, I'll tell you. He dressed up as a woman to attend a festival that only women are supposed to attend, and he would have gotten away with it if he wouldn't have if he would have kept his big mouth shut, because he thought it was the most hilarious thing to talk about it in a dinner party, in which included a lot of guests who were not as liberal and open-minded as he thought. So this career path is close to him, and he's in a lot of legal trouble, which he kind of slip away from. Which he doesn't slip away from, but he gets punished for it. But anyhow, he knows that he needs some sort of immunity, and the tribune of the plebs have immunity. They have the potestas. They have the ability to have sanctity of their body. Nobody can seize them. You technically are not allowed to seize or hit anybody, any free citizen of Rome. But if you seize or hit a tribune of the plebs, you're considered as if you have committed sacrilege against the gods and against the state itself, which is basically the same thing. So this way he knows that his enemies will not dare attack him openly, and then pretended it is because they were so scandalized by his conduct So, and besides, as tribune of the plebs, he is stationed in a very advantageous position to revenge certain people that he blames in particular for his fall, amongst them Cicero. Now, Cicero never liked him, and he's somewhat involved in the entire scandal. And one of the things, one of the laws that he promulgates before the assembly of the people, when he is tribune of the plebs, are that there should be a committee, and the committee should investigate whoever used his public power to execute Roman citizens without trial, and this person should be exiled, or as the Romans would say, he should be banned from fire and water, and from Rome, Latium, and Italy, and his house should be pulled down and would dedicate it as a temple to Concordia, the goddess of concord. So, the citizens assembly doesn't think too much of it. I mean, that sounds reasonable enough. And after all, during the reign of Sulla, there were plenty of people that, they were guilty. So they were thinking that they're getting rid of some of the least savory part of the ex-Sulla faction. Fair enough. Now he uses it against Cicero. He says, Cicero was the consul at the time, and under his authority, all these people were executed without trial. You don't do that, Mr. Cicero. No. So Cicero is banished from the city for a while, like 10 years, until one of his friends promulgated a law that brings him back home and returns his estate to him, etc. And yeah, this is but the interesting thing is that Claudius becomes a close ally of Caesar, and as a matter of fact, Caesar takes the faction that assembles around Claudius and he takes it over and he moderates it. And later in life, when Caesar takes over the Republic, famously, it will be Caesar who would execute people without trial, and then when the civil war happens between Caesar and the Senate, people will be very scared because they knew that, because they would remember. Well, according to Sallust, they remember what Caesar warned them from, but I think they will just. But whether Caesar actually gave the speech that Sallust report him giving or not, people will make the calculation. He declares himself a dictator, and then a dictator for life. He might use his authority to do what we did to the Catiline conspirators. And in many cases he does. When he doesn't, he portrayed as an act of clemency. I have this authority, and I based on this precedence, but I choose not to do that because I'm a very clement and merciful person, and I choose to show compassion and to let people who I believe acted out of their patriotic duty to continue to serve the Republic. Now, Caesar famously is assassinated, and Cicero quietly supports this assassination. At least he says he does after it happens. And of course, he started to talk again. When Octavian started rising to prominence, Cicero is not that worried about Octavian. He's more worried about Mark Antony, because Mark Antony is already an established soldier and an orator and an experienced politician who was a tribune of the plebs for a while, etc., etc., etc. And so you think Mark Antony is the most dangerous one. I'll make an alliance with Octavian, who is just a teenage boy, a very brilliant teenage boy, but teenage boy nonetheless. And this way I split the Caesarian faction and I tie it to my faction, which is the moderate Optimates, and In this way, we can save the. In this way, well, we couldn't save Cato, but we can save the Republic. That's good. The problem is Octavian is and you know, with the fullness of time, we'll get rid of Octavian. Octavian is shrewder than Cicero give him credit to. He makes an alliance with Mark Antony, and what's known as the Second Triumvirate, between him, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. And Lepidus is a non-entity. So, and one of the first things they do, they decided, okay, here, let's make a list of the people we really, really don't like, that really, really should be 6 foot under. And I'll give some names, and you'll give some names, and everything. And Lepidus, you give some name, because apparently you are in this too. And we will prescribe them in the same manner that Sulla did, and we have the authority because, well, there's the precedence from Catiline. There's the precedence from the Catiline conspiracy. Again, and one of the names that Mark Antony promulgates that is Cicero's. And yeah, and Cicero is killed. As a matter of fact, Mark Antony's men add a flourish to it, because they cut off Cicero's hands, and they cut off his head, and they put the head on the rostra, which is the speaker's podium, you might say, in the assembly, and they nail his hands to the doors of the Senate. Yes. Yes, I'm coming. I'm coming in a moment. I'm coming right away. Excuse me. So, and this is the end of it. Was it good? Was it bad? You'll be the judgment of it. But the fact is that constitutional republicanism of Rome dies that day, together with Cicero. Octavian and Mark Antony fight, eventually literally fight, over who would control the empire, but Octavian eventually wins, and he becomes the first proper Roman emperor. But the day Cicero died, the assemblies were no longer important, the Senate was no longer important. All that was important was the executive at the hand of the military, in this case, Mark Antony and Lepidus, and of course, Octavian. So, what do we learn from this? I don't know. That's left to you to decide. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
They'll find what by felling and mauling our railmakers, statesmen can do. The people are everywhere calling for Lincoln and liberty too. We'll go for the son of Kentucky, the hero of Hoosierdom through. The pride of the sucker so lucky